She came to the West to escape death, but instead, she found a broken home, a grieving man, and a child who hadn't spoken in a year. Two souls shattered by the past. One stranger who dared to stay. And in a land full of dust and danger, can love truly bring people back to life? Meaning of the story: even the deepest wounds can heal when someone chooses to stay. If this touches, this channel brings you powerful Western stories about cowboys, love, motherhood, human kindness, and the bonds that heal us. If this touches you, comment, share, and subscribe for more meaningful stories.
The wind in Blackwood, Montana didn't just blow, it scraped. It carried coarse red dust that settled into the weave of Clara Vance's only decent traveling dress and ground between her teeth. She stood on the splintered wooden platform of the train station, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of a battered leather suitcase. The steam engine that had brought her from the East Coast let out a final deafening shriek before chugging away, leaving behind a thick cloud of black smoke and a silence that felt heavier than the midday sun. Clara smoothed her skirt, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Beau was supposed to be here. Beau Fletcher, the man who had written her months of sweeping poetic letters, the rancher who had promised her safety, a home and a marriage ring to replace the terrifying nightmare her life had become. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The platform remained painfully empty. "If you're waiting for a welcoming committee, honey, you're out of luck." Clara turned. An older woman with sharp eyes and a face weathered like tanned leather stood in the doorway of the station's post office. She held a broom, though the dust blowing across the planks made sweeping a fool's errand. "I'm waiting for Mr. Fletcher," Clara said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Beau Fletcher. We are to be married." The woman, whose apron read Cora, stopped sweeping. A look of profound, exhausted pity crossed her features. Lord Almighty, another one. Clara's stomach plummeted. "Excuse me?" "Beau Fletcher ain't a rancher, sweetie," Cora said, leaning heavily on her broom. "He's a silver-tongued drifter. He rolled out of Blackwood 3 days ago on a midnight freight, and if you wired him any money for travel arrangements or ranch supplies before you got here, it's gone. He drank half of it at the saloon and took the rest with him." The world tilted on its axis. Clara couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs turned to glass. Gone. The $70 she had scraped together, her last lifeline, was gone. But it wasn't just the money. It was what the money represented. Survival. Back in New York, the men her late father owed a small fortune in gambling debts weren't the forgiving sort. They didn't send letters. They sent men with brass knuckles and cold eyes. Clara had fled in the dead of night, using her last dime to reach Montana, betting her life on the promises of a stranger. Now she was stranded at the edge of the world with an empty pocket and a target on her back. Clara sank onto her suitcase. The leather groaned, a seam finally splitting under her weight. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking not with tears but with a raw, suffocating terror. She was dead. It was only a matter of time before they tracked her here. Then, a shadow fell over her. Clara blinked, looking up through the haze of the relentless sun. Standing less than a foot away was a little boy. He couldn't have been older than 6. He was painfully thin, dressed in faded overalls that were a size too large, his dark hair a messy tangle beneath a worn, flat-brimmed hat. But it was his eyes that made Clara's breath hitch. They were a striking, stormy gray, but entirely hollow. They held the 1,000-yard stare of a seasoned soldier, a profound, silent grief that didn't belong on a child's face. "Hello," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't speak. He didn't blink. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out a small, dirt-smudged hand. Clara hesitated. She had nothing to offer him, but the sheer gravity in his silent request compelled her. Trembling, Clara reached out and let her pale, slender fingers wrap around his small, rough hand. His grip was astonishingly tight, as if she were the only thing tethering him to the earth. Suddenly, the frantic thunder of hooves shattered the quiet. A massive black stallion reared up near the edge of the platform, kicking up a storm of dust. The rider swung down before the horse had even fully stopped. He was a towering, broad-shouldered man, his clothes dusted with the trail. A faded Stetson shadowed his face, but Clara could see the jagged, pale scar that slashed down the left side of his jaw, disappearing into the collar of his shirt. He moved with predatory speed, his hand dropping instinctively to the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh. "Toby!" the man roared, his voice rough as gravel. Clara scrambled to her feet, instinctively pulling the boy slightly behind her skirt to shield him from the angry stranger. "Stay back!" she yelled. The man froze. He didn't pull his gun. Instead, his stormy gray eyes, the exact same eyes as the boy's, locked onto their joined hands. The fury in his face dissolved into a shock so absolute it looked like he had been struck by lightning. He stared at Clara's hand wrapped around his son's. His jaw worked, but for a long moment, no sound came out. The man breathed, the tough, scarred exterior cracking for a fraction of a second. "He hasn't touched another human being in a year." Wyatt Thorne didn't know whether to draw his gun or drop to his knees. For 12 agonizing months, ever since the fire that had taken Eleanor and nearly burned the soul out of his son, Toby had been a ghost. The boy didn't speak. He flinched at shadows. If Wyatt even tried to hug his own son, Toby would retreat into a catatonic state of pure terror. Yet here Toby was, gripping the hand of a pale, terrified stranger in a dusty blue dress, as if she were his salvation. Wyatt forced his hand away from his holster and took a slow, deliberate step forward, treating the woman like a spooked mare. "Ma'am, let go of my boy." "He took my hand," Clara said, her chin lifting defensively despite the slight tremble in her frame. "And I won't let go until he wants to." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. He took in her split suitcase, the fine but dust-covered fabric of her dress, and the desperate, cornered animal look in her eyes. Another mail-order bride dumped by the train. "Toby," Wyatt said softly, dropping to one knee on the dusty planks. "Come here, son. Let's go home." Toby looked at his father, his face blank. Then he stepped toward Wyatt. But he dragged Clara along with him, his small fingers locked around hers in a death grip. Wyatt cursed softly under his breath. He stood up, towering over Clara, casting a long, intimidating shadow. "I don't know who you are, lady, but my boy isn't a stray dog you can just feed and keep. We're leaving." "I have nowhere to go," Clara blurted out. The words tasted like ash, but she had no pride left to swallow. "The man who brought me here robbed me. I am entirely without funds." She swallowed hard, her eyes locking onto his. "If I stay on this platform, I will die." Wyatt studied her. She wasn't exaggerating. He recognized the look of real survival fear. He looked down at Toby, who was leaning his small weight against Clara's skirt. Wyatt hadn't seen his son seek comfort in a year. He couldn't rip him away, not when the boy was finally reaching out from the darkness. "Grab your bag," Wyatt ground out, turning on his heel. "My wagon's hitched behind the feed store. You're coming with us." The ride to the Thorne Ranch was suffocatingly silent. The landscape of Blackwood was brutal and majestic, rolling plains of sagebrush backing into jagged, pine-covered mountains. When they arrived, Clara saw that the ranch matched the man, vast, scarred, and severely neglected. The fences sagged. The paint on the two-story farmhouse was peeling, and about 50 yards away stood the charred, blackened skeletal remains of a massive barn. Wyatt didn't look at the ruins. Toby squeezed Clara's hand tighter as they passed it. Inside, the house was a tomb of dust and shadows. "Here is the deal," Wyatt said, tossing his hat onto a peg. He turned to face her in the dim light of the kitchen. "You need a place to hide and money to leave. I need..." He glanced at Toby, who had finally let go of Clara to examine a wooden block on the floor. "I need someone to keep this house from collapsing, and to watch the boy while I work the herd. 3 months. You cook, you clean, you look after Toby. At the end of it, I'll buy you a first-class ticket to anywhere on the East Coast you want to go. Room, board, and protection." "Protection from what?" Clara asked, her heart skipping a beat. Did he know? "From whatever put that look in your eyes at the station," Wyatt said flatly. "I don't ask questions. You don't ask questions. This isn't a family. It's a business arrangement. Understood?" "Understood," Clara agreed, ignoring the sharp sting of his coldness. It was better this way. If he knew the violent men who were currently hunting her, he would throw her back to the wolves. Over the next 3 days, Clara worked until her hands blistered. She attacked the grime of the farmhouse with a vengeance, trying to scrub away her own mounting anxiety. Toby shadowed her every step. He didn't speak, but he handed her soap when she washed dishes and sat at her feet when she mended clothes. On the 4th afternoon, while Wyatt was out riding the fence line, Clara tackled the study, a room Wyatt had told her to avoid, but the layer of dust had finally provoked her. It was a dark room, smelling of stale tobacco and old leather. While wiping down a heavy oak bookshelf, her rag snagged on a loose wooden panel behind a row of encyclopedias. The panel clattered to the floor, revealing a hollowed-out cubby. Inside was a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Clara picked them up, intending to put them back, but her breath hitched. She recognized the handwriting instantly, the elegant sweeping loops of the T's and B's. It was the exact same penmanship as the letters sitting in her ruined suitcase. Beau Fletcher's handwriting. Her hands trembling, Clara slipped the top letter from the ribbon. But it wasn't addressed to Clara Vance. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, Wyatt's dead wife. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "Wyatt does not deserve you. Bring the deed as we discussed. We will sell the land and leave this wretched dust behind." Clara dropped the letter as if it had caught fire. Beau hadn't just been a con man who swindled her. He had been entangled with Wyatt's wife. He was the reason this family was broken. That night, a violent thunderstorm rolled over the plains. Clara lay awake in her narrow bed in the spare room, the stolen letter burning a hole in her mind. Should she show Wyatt? If she did, she risked unleashing the terrifying anger of a scarred, grieving man. Amidst the crash of thunder, a different sound cut through the night. Thud, 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 hoofbeats. Not the heavy rhythmic trot of Wyatt's draft horses, but the sharp, fast strike of a light riding horse moving stealthily into the yard. Clara threw off her quilt, her blood turning to ice water. She crept to the window, peering out through the rain-streaked glass. A cloaked figure sat on horseback near the edge of the porch. The rider raised an arm. Thwack! Something buried itself into the wooden post of the front porch. The rider wheeled his horse around and vanished into the storm. Clara didn't wait for Wyatt. Throwing a shawl over her nightgown, she unbolted the front door and stepped onto the freezing, rain-swept porch. Buried deep into the wood of the support pillar was a heavy, steel-hilted hunting knife. Pinned beneath the blade was a soaked piece of paper. Clara grabbed the hilt, yanking the knife free with a desperate pull. She unfolded the wet paper. In crude block letters, the ink bleeding in the rain, were 2 words: "Found you." The steel of the hunting knife was heavy and freezing against Clara's palm. She stood on the porch for a long, breathless moment, the relentless Montana rain soaking through her thin nightgown, plastering her dark hair to her cheeks. She stared at the crude, bleeding ink on the paper. "Found you." Panic, cold and absolute, wrapped its fingers around her throat. The men from New York had crossed the country. They were here, lurking in the vast, shadowed expanse of the jagged mountains, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse before they moved in for the kill. Clara's first instinct was to run to Wyatt, to pound on his bedroom door and beg for the protection he had promised. But the memory of the stolen letters she had found in his study, Beau Fletcher's letters to Wyatt's dead wife, stopped her dead in her tracks. Wyatt Thorne was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, held back only by his silent, traumatized son. If Clara brought the violent criminal underworld of the East Coast to his doorstep, he wouldn't protect her. He would throw her out into the storm to save his boy, and she couldn't even blame him. With shaking hands, Clara folded the wet note, slipped it into her pocket, and hid the hunting knife beneath the loose floorboard in her bedroom, right next to Beau's treacherous letters. She would have to carry this terror alone. For the next 2 weeks, Clara threw herself into the grueling labor of the ranch with a manic, desperate energy. If she kept moving, she couldn't think about the knife. She scrubbed the wide plank floors until her knuckles bled and the wood gleamed. She tackled the overgrown kitchen garden, pulling weeds until her fingernails were packed with dark earth. She baked sourdough bread, roasted wild game that Wyatt brought home, and mended clothes that had been neglected for a year. Through it all, Toby was her silent, steadfast shadow. The boy never spoke a word, but his presence was a heavy, constant comfort. When Clara knelt in the dirt to plant late-season carrots, Toby knelt beside her, his small hands patting the soil flat. When she hung the heavy wet laundry on the line as the wind whipped across the plains, Toby stood at her feet, handing her wooden clothespins one by one. He was a child locked inside his own mind, but Clara realized quickly that he didn't need pity. He needed an anchor. She became that anchor. She hummed to him while she cooked, softly singing old Irish lullabies her mother had taught her, ignoring the way her own voice trembled. Wyatt watched them. He thought he was subtle, observing from beneath the pulled-down brim of his Stetson as he repaired a bridle on the porch, or pausing by the barn door to watch Clara and Toby in the yard. But Clara felt the weight of his stormy gray eyes tracking her every movement. The tension between them was a physical, living thing, tightening like a coiled spring with every passing day. Wyatt was a man composed entirely of rough edges and dark moods, but Clara began to notice the microscopic cracks in his armor. She saw how carefully he moved around Toby, as if afraid his massive frame would shatter the boy. She saw the exhaustion etched into the deep lines around his mouth, the burden of a man trying to keep the world from crushing what little he had left. The shift happened on a Tuesday evening. The kitchen was suffocatingly warm from the cast-iron stove. Clara was at the dry sink, plunging a stack of tin plates into soapy water. Wyatt stepped through the back door, bringing the scent of pine needles, leather, and sweat into the cramped space. He walked to the wash basin beside the counter to scrub the grease from his hands. "The boy ate a full plate of stew tonight," Wyatt said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down Clara's spine. "He was hungry," Clara replied, keeping her eyes on the suds. "He helped me carry firewood this afternoon. He's stronger than he looks." Wyatt reached for the coarse linen towel hanging on the hook between them. At the exact same second, Clara reached for the same towel to dry a plate. Their hands collided. Wyatt's fingers, rough with thick calluses and scarred from years of brutal labor, brushed against the soft, pale skin of Clara's wrist. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, but it struck like a match touched to dry kerosene. Clara gasped, jerking her hand back. Wyatt froze, his gaze snapping from their hands up to her face. In the dim, amber glow of the kerosene lantern, Clara saw the sudden, fierce flaring of heat in his eyes, a raw, masculine awareness that stripped away his cold indifference. For a second that stretched into an eternity, neither of them breathed. The air in the kitchen grew impossibly thick. Wyatt's chest rose and fell heavily, his eyes dropping to Clara's lips before snapping back to her eyes. Then the iron walls slammed back down. Wyatt cursed under his breath, stepping back so abruptly he knocked against the doorframe. He turned and walked out into the night without another word, leaving Clara clutching the edge of the sink, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. It was a dangerous distraction. She couldn't afford to feel anything for the brooding rancher, not with the threat of the New York debt collectors hanging over her, and certainly not when she was hiding the truth about his dead wife. The crisis arrived 3 nights later. A sudden autumn chill had swept down from the mountains, bringing a bitter, biting frost. After Toby had gone to sleep, Clara decided to build up the fire in the great room's stone hearth. As she searched her meager belongings for scrap fabric to use as kindling, she pulled out the travel dress she had worn on the train. It was ruined, torn at the hem, stained irrevocably with mud and grease. A bitter reminder of the foolish, naive woman who had believed Beau Fletcher's lies. With a surge of angry resolve, Clara tossed the ruined dress into the roaring fireplace. The fabric caught instantly. The flames chewed through the cotton and lace, sending a thick, acrid cloud of gray smoke billowing into the room for a few seconds before the draft pulled it up the chimney. The sharp, foul stench of burning cloth filled the air. Clara stepped back, wiping her soot-stained hands on her apron, feeling a small sense of closure. The heavy oak front door swung open. Wyatt stepped inside, stomping the mud from his boots. "Wind's picking up. Looks like we're in for a—" He stopped. Wyatt inhaled the scent of the burning dress, hitting his lungs. Instantly, the blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His broad shoulders went completely rigid. Clara turned, offering a tired smile. "I was just building up the fire. It's freezing out there." Wyatt didn't hear her. His stormy eyes dilated, completely consuming the irises until they were nothing but black voids. He wasn't looking at Clara. He wasn't looking at the stone hearth. He was staring at something a year in the past, something horrific and all-consuming. "Eleanor," Wyatt choked out, the word tearing from his throat like a physical wound. "Wyatt?" Clara took a step forward, her brow furrowing in alarm. "Wyatt, what is it?" "The door's stuck!" Wyatt suddenly roared, his voice cracking with a panicked, guttural desperation that made Clara jump. He lunged forward, not toward Clara, but toward the solid wooden wall of the cabin, his hands clawing wildly at the timber as if trying to tear it down. "I can't get it open. Eleanor, push! Push the beam!" "Wyatt, stop!" Clara cried, realizing with creeping horror what was happening. The smell of the burning fabric. It had triggered a flashback. He was back in the barn. He was reliving the fire. Wyatt spun around, knocking over a heavy wooden chair, sending it crashing into splinters against the floorboards. He was gasping for air, clutching his chest, his powerful frame shaking violently. He looked at his hands as if expecting to see them blistered and melting. "I can't breathe," he wheezed, stumbling backward, his boots slipping on the rug. "It's too hot. Toby, where's the boy?" "Toby is safe," Clara shouted, rushing forward to grab his arm. "Wyatt, look at me. You're in the house. The fire is gone." The moment Clara's hands clamped onto his forearms, Wyatt recoiled violently, shoving her away with a blind, desperate strength. Clara stumbled and fell hard onto the floorboards, her elbows striking the wood with a sharp crack. Wyatt stared at her fallen form for a split second, a flash of horrified recognition breaking through the nightmare. But the phantom smoke was too thick in his mind. He let out a ragged, agonizing shout, tore the front door open, and bolted out into the freezing, pitch-black night, disappearing into the torrential downpour that had just begun to fall. Clara sat on the floor, rubbing her bruised elbow, her heart breaking in her chest. The fierce, untouchable Wyatt Thorne was a man walking around with third-degree burns on his soul. And Clara had just inadvertently thrown salt into the deepest wound he had. The rain hammered against the tin roof of the porch with a deafening, rhythmic violence. Clara didn't hesitate. She checked Toby's room. The boy was mercifully asleep, buried under a mound of quilts, before grabbing a heavy oil lantern and a wool blanket and throwing open the front door. The Montana storm was merciless. The wind whipped her hair into her eyes and drove the freezing rain through her shawl in seconds. She held the lantern high, the flickering yellow light cutting a narrow path through the gloom. She knew exactly where he had gone. Clara sprinted across the muddy yard, her boots slipping in the muck until she reached the stables. She hauled the heavy wooden door open and slipped inside, the sudden quiet of the barn a stark contrast to the howling tempest outside. It smelled of sweet hay, damp earth, and horseflesh. "Wyatt?" she called out softly. A low, ragged breath answered her from the back of the barn. Clara moved slowly down the center aisle, the lantern light dancing over the nervous, shifting horses. In the last stall where Wyatt kept his massive black stallion, she found him. Wyatt was sitting in the dirt and hay, his back pressed hard against the wooden partition. His knees were drawn up, his arms resting on them, and his head was bowed. The stallion was standing over him, its large head lowered, gently nudging Wyatt's shoulder in a silent, equine attempt at comfort. Wyatt looked utterly broken. The intimidating stoic rancher had been stripped away, leaving behind a man drowning in an ocean of guilt. Clara stepped into the stall. She set the lantern on an overturned bucket and knelt in the hay beside him. She didn't speak. She just draped the thick wool blanket over his shivering, soaking wet shoulders. Wyatt didn't look up, but his hands gripped the edges of the blanket. "The barn doors were barred from the outside," Wyatt whispered. His voice was so hoarse, so hollow, it barely sounded human. "I was in the lower pasture. By the time I saw the smoke, the roof was already coming down." Clara remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. He was finally talking. "Eleanor had gone in to check the foals," Wyatt continued, his eyes fixed blindly on the dirt between his boots. "Toby had followed her. When I got there, the heat was... It was like opening the door to hell. I heard her screaming my name. I took an axe to the doors, but the main support beam had collapsed against it. I couldn't move it. I couldn't save her." Wyatt squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear cutting a clean line down his soot-stained face. "I managed to break a side window. Eleanor pushed Toby through it just before the roof caved in. Toby didn't make a sound. He just looked at me. He hasn't spoken a word since that night." Wyatt finally turned his head to look at Clara, his gray eyes swimming in absolute devastation. "I stood there and listened to my wife burn to death, Clara. I'm a coward. I should have died with her." "No," Clara said, her voice fierce and steady, cutting through his self-hatred. She shifted closer, the heat of her knee pressing against his. "You saved your son, and you stayed alive to raise him. That is not cowardice, Wyatt. That is the hardest, bravest thing a man can do." "You don't understand," Wyatt muttered, shaking his head. "The smell. When you burned that cloth, it brought it all back. The smell of her." He choked, unable to finish the sentence. Clara acted purely on instinct. She reached out and placed her hands on either side of his rough, stubble-covered face. Wyatt flinched slightly, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, exhaling a shuddering breath as Clara's thumbs gently wiped the rain and tears from his cheeks. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered fiercely. "I am so sorry I caused that. I was just burning an old dress. I didn't know." Wyatt lifted his hands, meaning to gently remove her hands from his face. But as his large, calloused fingers wrapped around her slender wrists, the coarse wool of her shawl slipped off her left shoulder. The neckline of her nightgown slouched, exposing the pale skin of her collarbone and the top of her left arm. Wyatt's breath hitched, but not from the intimacy. His stormy eyes locked onto her exposed skin. Etched across Clara's upper arm and shoulder was a web of thick, jagged, silvery scars. They were old, but they were vicious. The unmistakable, violent marks of a leather strap or a whip laid into the flesh with brutal force. The sorrow in Wyatt's eyes vanished, instantly replaced by a dark, lethal fury. He didn't let go of her wrists. Instead, his grip shifted, his thumbs brushing lightly, reverently over the edge of the scars. "Who did this to you?" Wyatt demanded, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a dangerous, protective rage. Clara tried to pull away, suddenly ashamed, but Wyatt held her firm. "Clara," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, demanding the truth. "Who?" "My father," Clara whispered, the shame tasting like bile in her throat. "When he drank, and when he lost at the card tables." She looked away, staring at the hay. "He died 6 months ago. But he left behind debts, massive debts to terrible, ruthless men. Men who don't care that he's dead. They just want their money, and they decided I was the collateral. She finally met Wyatt's gaze, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "That is why I answered Beau Fletcher's advertisement. That is why I came to Montana. I was running for my life. I'm still running, Wyatt. They are out there. And if they find me, they will kill me." Wyatt stared at her, absorbing the magnitude of her confession. This delicate, beautiful woman who baked bread and sang to his traumatized son was carrying a nightmare just as heavy as his own. They were two broken, bleeding things hiding from the monsters in the dark. Slowly, Wyatt released her wrists. He reached up, gently pulling her shawl back over her shoulder to cover the scars, his knuckles brushing her neck in a gesture so tender it made Clara's heart ache. "They aren't going to touch you," Wyatt said, his voice a solemn, unbreakable vow. "Not while I have breath in my lungs. You are safe on this ranch, Clara. Do you hear me?" Clara nodded, a tear finally slipping free. For the first time in her life, she actually believed it. The atmosphere in the farmhouse changed drastically over the next week. The cold, impenetrable wall Wyatt had kept between them was gone. In its place was an acute, magnetic awareness. They moved around each other in the kitchen, with a quiet, synchronized grace. Wyatt began chopping extra firewood for her stove without being asked. Clara began leaving a hot cup of black coffee on the porch railing for him before he rode out at dawn. Even Toby seemed to sense the thaw. One afternoon, while Clara was baking a pie, she accidentally tipped a sack of flour, sending a white cloud exploding over her face and apron. She sputtered, wiping the flour from her eyelashes. A sound broke the quiet of the kitchen. It was a small, breathy giggle. Clara froze. She slowly turned to look at Toby, who was sitting at the table. The boy had both hands clamped over his mouth, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter, his gray eyes sparkling for the first time. Clara beamed, her heart swelling to twice its size. When she handed him a slice of the baked pie later, Toby didn't just take it. He reached out, gave the sleeve of her dress 2 sharp, deliberate tugs, and offered a firm nod, "Thank you." They were healing. Slowly, miraculously, the Thorn Ranch was becoming a home. By the end of the week, the pantry was running dangerously low on staples. Wyatt was waist-deep in branding the late spring calves and couldn't leave the herd. "Take the wagon into Blackwood," Wyatt told Clara at breakfast, pressing a small leather pouch of coins into her hand. "Buy flour, sugar, salt, and whatever you need for the boy. Mr. Henderson at the general store is a fair man. Just stick to the main street and you'll be fine." The fact that Wyatt trusted her with the wagon and his money was a monumental shift. Clara accepted the pouch, feeling a surge of pride. "I'll be back before sundown." The ride into Blackwood was uneventful. The town was bustling with the afternoon trade. Cowboys loading supplies, women in practical dresses sweeping the boardwalks, the distant rhythmic clanging of the blacksmith's hammer. Clara navigated the wagon to the front of Henderson's Mercantile, tied the draft horse to the hitching post, and went inside. She spent an hour gathering supplies, enjoying the brief return to civilization. Mr. Henderson loaded a heavy sack of flour onto her shoulder, tipping his hat to her. "Put it on, Mr. On. Thorne's tab or paying cash, ma'am?" he asked. "Cash today, thank you," Clara said, smiling as she paid him from the pouch. She turned, adjusting the heavy sack on her shoulder, and pushed open the wooden door of the Mercantile to step back out onto the sunlit boardwalk. As she stepped through the frame, a man walking briskly down the planks collided with her. The impact wasn't hard, but it threw Clara off balance. The sack of flour slipped from her grasp, hitting the wooden boards with a dull thud, sending a small puff of white dust into the air. "My deepest apologies, miss," a smooth baritone voice purred. "Allow me." The man bent down to retrieve the sack. As he did, a highly familiar, sickeningly sweet scent hit Clara's nose. Bay rum cologne mixed with expensive cigar smoke. Clara's blood turned to ice in her veins, her breath trapped in her throat. The man straightened up, holding the flour. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray long coat that looked far too expensive for a dusty Montana cattle town. He reached up with a gloved hand and casually tipped the brim of his pristine bowler hat. A handsome, rakish smile spread across his perfectly groomed face, his pale blue eyes gleaming with predatory amusement. "Hello, my dear Clara," Beau Fletcher said softly, his voice sliding over her like a cold snake. "Did you miss me?" The world around Clara ceased to exist. The rhythmic hammering from the blacksmith's forge faded into a dull underwater throb. The chatter of the boardwalk evaporated. There was only the cloying, sickeningly sweet scent of bay rum cologne and the terrifyingly handsome face of the man who had authored her destruction. Beau Fletcher smiled, his pale blue eyes crinkling at the corners in a perfect imitation of polite charm. He held the heavy sack of flour as effortlessly as a gentleman holding a lady's parasol. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, my dear," Beau murmured, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried not a single ounce of the frontier's grit. He took a step closer, invading her space, forcing Clara to press her spine against the rough, sun-baked timber of the mercantile's exterior wall. "Give that back to me," Clara said. To her own absolute astonishment, her voice did not shake. Her heart was battering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but a cold, heavy stone of pure survival instinct had dropped into her stomach. Now, is that any way to greet your betrothed?" Beau tisked, stepping sideways and subtly forcing her to move with him, away from the open door of the mercantile and toward the narrow, shadowed alleyway that separated the store from the assayer's office. "I must admit, Clara, I am genuinely astounded to see you drawing breath. When I left you at that station, I assumed the elements, or your rather unsavory acquaintances from the east, would have claimed you by now." Clara stopped moving, planting her boots firmly in the dust of the alley. The shadows here were deep, shielding them from the prying eyes of the main street. "You stole everything I had. You left me to die." "I took $70, Clara. A pittance for my time and the ink I wasted on those dreadfully romantic letters," Beau replied, his smile dropping, revealing the cold, calculating machinery beneath his charming facade. He dropped the sack of flour into the dirt at her feet. A small plume of white dust coated the toes of Clara's boots. "But let us not dwell on the past. I am a forward-looking man, and it seems fate has thrown us back together for a highly lucrative reason." "I have nothing left for you to steal," Clara spat, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "If you do not let me pass, I will scream for the sheriff." Beau laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Scream, my dear. Please do. Sheriff Holden is a reasonable man. I wonder how reasonable he will be when I tell him that the sweet, tragic woman working at the Thorn Ranch is actually a fugitive. Tell me, Clara, how much is the bounty on your head these days? Old man Vitiello, back in New York, is still quite irate about your father's gambling debts. In fact, I saw two men in crisp bowler hats step off the eastbound train just yesterday. They have thick accents and very, very cold eyes." Clara's lungs seized. The air was suddenly too thin to breathe. The note on the porch. "Found you." It hadn't been the debt collectors. It had been Beau. He had been watching her. "You wrote the note," she whispered, her blood running like ice water through her veins. "I have a flair for the dramatic," Beau conceded, casually examining his pristine leather gloves. "I needed to know if you would run. When you stayed, I realized you must have found a very compelling reason to endure the company of a scarred, half-mad brute like Wyatt Thorne. Which brings us to my proposition. I want nothing to do with you." "Oh, but you do," Beau countered, his pale eyes flashing with sudden venomous intensity. He closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, grabbing Clara by the upper arm. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness, his fingers digging into her flesh with bruising force. "Listen to me very carefully, you little fool. I am not some petty mail-order bride swindler. That is merely a hobby to fund my travels. I work for the Pacific Union Bank." Clara struggled, but his grip was like a vice. "Let me go! The Pacific Union Bank is buying up this entire valley to control the water rights for the new railway spur," Beau hissed, his face inches from hers. "But Wyatt Thorne, that stubborn, grieving idiot, refuses to sell the largest parcel of land. His ranch sits squarely over the prime reservoir access. The bank sent me here 2 years ago to acquire that land by any means necessary. Clara stopped struggling, a creeping horror beginning to dawn in her mind. She thought of the hidden cubby in Wyatt's study. She thought of the elegant handwriting on the letters tied with ribbon. My dearest Eleanor. You, Clara breathed, her eyes widening. You wrote the letters to Eleanor Thorne. Beau's expression shifted from anger to a twisted, arrogant pride. Ah, so you've been snooping. Excellent. Then you know I didn't just write to her. I charmed her. I made that bored, desperate woman feel like a queen. Wyatt was always out in the dirt, covered in cow blood and sweat. Eleanor wanted poetry. She wanted Paris. I promised her the world, and all she had to do was bring me the original deed to the ranch so we could sell it out from under her husband. Bile rose in the back of Clara's throat. She stared at the handsome face before her and saw a monster of unimaginable cruelty. You seduced a married woman just to steal her land. It was business, Clara, nothing more, Beau said dismissively. But then his jaw tightened and a shadow of genuine irritation crossed his features. Unfortunately, the silly cow grew a conscience at the 11th hour. The night we were supposed to leave, she met me in the barn. But she didn't have the deed. She said she couldn't do it to her son. She threatened to scream, to wake Wyatt and tell him everything unless I left Blackwood forever. The world seemed to stop spinning. The sounds of the town completely vanished. Clara felt as though she were standing on the edge of a bottomless abyss, looking down into pure darkness. What did you do? Clara whispered, though every instinct in her body screamed that she already knew the horrific answer. Beau's pale eyes were entirely devoid of humanity. I am a professional, Clara. I do not leave loose ends, and I certainly do not let a weeping housewife ruin a $10,000 commission from the bank. I hit her. She fell into a pile of hay and hit her head. When I realized she was unconscious, I simply barred the heavy stable doors from the outside, and I knocked over a kerosene lantern. Clara let out a choked, ragged gasp, violently wrenching her arm out of his grasp. She stumbled backward, hitting the wall of the assayer's office. She looked at his hands, expecting them to be dripping with blood. He murdered her. He had trapped a woman in a burning building and walked away. He was the reason Toby was locked in a prison of silence. He was the reason Wyatt Thorne woke up screaming in the dead of night, his soul incinerated by an unwarranted guilt. You burned her alive, Clara said, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. You monster! Wyatt thinks it was an accident. He blames himself. And that guilt keeps him conveniently distracted, Beau said, adjusting the cuffs of his coat as if they had been discussing the weather. However, my employers are losing patience. They need the deed. Without the original parchment, the legal transfer of the water rights is tied up in territorial courts for a decade. Eleanor hid it somewhere in that farmhouse before she came out to the barn that night. I know she did. She told me she moved it from Wyatt's safe. Beau took a step toward her, extending a single gloved finger to trace the line of Clara's trembling jaw. She flinched away, her stomach turning. Here is the bargain, my sweet Clara, Beau murmured softly, lethally. You live in that house now. You clean its corners. You have 3 days to find that deed and bring it to me at the saloon in town. If you deliver it, I will give you $1,000 in cash and a safe escort to California, far away from Vitiello's men. And if I refuse? Clara challenged, her chin lifting, a spark of pure, unadulterated hatred igniting in her chest. Beau's smile was razor-sharp. If you refuse, or if you tell Wyatt a single word of this conversation, I will walk straight to the sheriff. I will show him a forged marriage certificate proving you are my runaway wife who stole my life savings. I will tell the town you are a fugitive. I will lead the New York men straight to the Thorne Ranch. Wyatt will try to protect you, of course, and they will shoot him dead. They will burn that house to the ground, just like the barn, and little Toby will be left an orphan, if he survives at all. He leaned in, his breath hot against her ear. 3 days, Clara. Find the deed or I will slaughter your new makeshift family. The choice is entirely yours." Bo tipped his hat one last time, turned on his heel, and walked out of the alley, blending seamlessly back into the bustling crowd of the main street. Clara collapsed against the wooden wall, her legs giving out. She slid down into the dust beside the fallen sack of flour, burying her face in her hands. The terror was a physical weight, crushing her chest. She was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking up. To save Wyatt and Toby from the monsters hunting her, she would have to betray them to the monster who had already destroyed their lives. The ride back to the Thorn Ranch was an agonizing blur. Clara did not remember loading the heavy sack of flour into the wagon, nor did she remember untying the draft horse. Her mind was a chaotic, swirling storm of panic and grief. When the wagon finally crested the ridge and the sprawling, battered expanse of the Thorn Ranch came into view, Clara had to pull back on the reins and stop. She stared down at the valley. The jagged peaks of the mountains framed the property like a fortress. Down below, she could see the tiny, distant figure of Wyatt near the corral, working a young colt on a lunge line. Beside the porch, a smaller figure, Toby, was stacking small pieces of kindling waiting for her to return. They were so broken, yet so desperately trying to heal. And Clara had brought the devil directly to their doorstep. For the next 48 hours, Clara lived in a state of suspended animation. She moved through the chores like a ghost. She baked, she swept, she mended. But her eyes were constantly scanning the farmhouse. She looked behind heavy portraits, tapped on floorboards, and ran her hands along the undersides of the heavy oak tables. She was looking for the deed. Not to give it to Beau Fletcher, but to destroy it. If the deed burned, the bank's claim burned with it. But her search yielded nothing. Eleanor Thorne had hidden the document with the cunning of a desperate woman, and it remained lost to the shadows of the old house. As Clara's frantic hidden search continued, the delicate, newly formed trust between her and Wyatt began to strain. Wyatt was a man highly attuned to shifts in the atmosphere. He noticed the way Clara's hands shook when she poured the morning coffee. He noticed the dark, bruised exhaustion beneath her eyes. He noticed that when he entered a room, she flinched, her eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting an army to descend upon them. "You're jumping at shadows," Wyatt said on the evening of the second day. He was sitting at the heavy kitchen table, cleaning his Colt revolver by the light of a kerosene lamp. The metallic snick-snack of the gun parts was usually a comforting sound, a rhythm of protection. Tonight it sounded like a countdown. Clara stood at the stove, stirring a pot of beans with far more force than necessary. "I am merely tired, Wyatt. The ride into town took more out of me than I expected." Wyatt set the cylinder of the revolver down heavily on the oiled cloth. He looked up at her, his stormy gray eyes piercing straight through her weak facade. "You haven't looked me in the eyes since you got back from Blackwood. You hold the boy tighter than usual. You check the locks on the doors 3 times a night." He leaned forward, his massive frame casting a long, imposing shadow across the kitchen floor. "Did you see them? The men from the east?" Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She wanted to throw herself to the floor and confess everything. She wanted to tell him about Beau, about the murder of his wife, about the blackmail. But the memory of Wyatt tearing at the walls, consumed by his PTSD over the fire, silenced her. If she told him the truth, Wyatt would not call the sheriff. He would ride into town and kill Beau Fletcher in the middle of the street. He would be hanged for murder, and Toby would be left alone in a world that had already chewed him up. "No," Clara lied, her voice thick with unshed tears. She kept her back to him, staring blindly into the simmering pot. "I saw no one. Just ghosts in my own mind." Wyatt didn't push, but the silence that followed was heavy with disappointment. The bridge they had begun to build over the past weeks was crumbling. The next morning, the 3rd day of Beau's ultimatum, the storm finally broke. Wyatt had ridden into Blackwood at dawn to finalize the sale of 30 head of cattle. Clara spent the morning in a state of nauseating dread, pacing the floorboards of the farmhouse, jumping at every creak of the timber. She kept Toby close, reading him stories on the rug, her arms wrapped protectively around his thin shoulders. It was mid-afternoon when the rhythmic pounding of hooves signaled Wyatt's return. But he wasn't driving the cattle wagon. He was riding his black stallion, and he was pushing the beast to a dangerous, frothing gallop. Clara stood on the porch, her hand resting on Toby's head, as Wyatt brought the horse to a sliding, violent halt in the yard. The stallion reared, its hooves pawing the air before crashing down. Wyatt practically threw himself from the saddle. He looked like a man who had just walked through a hurricane. His jaw was locked so tight the muscles ticked visibly beneath his scarred skin. His eyes, usually a stormy gray, were dark and turbulent as a winter ocean. He marched up the porch steps, his heavy boots sounding like thunder. He didn't look at Clara. "Toby," Wyatt barked, his voice vibrating with a barely contained, lethal fury. "Go to your room. Shut the door." Toby looked up at Clara, his gray eyes wide with alarm. Clara gave him a gentle, reassuring push. "Go on, sweetheart. Do as your father says." The boy scampered into the house, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Wyatt stood over Clara. The sheer physical presence of his anger was suffocating. He reached into the inner pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a crumpled, official-looking document. He slammed it against the wooden post of the porch, holding it there with a white-knuckled fist. "I walked into the saloon today to meet the cattle buyer," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that was far more terrifying than a shout. The entire room went dead silent. Men I've known for 10 years, men I've bled with on the trail, looked at me like I was a rabid dog. "Do you know why, Clara?" Clara stared at the document pinned to the wood. The elaborate calligraphy, the official red wax seal. She didn't need to read it to know what it was. "A man named Beau Fletcher was standing at the bar," Wyatt continued, every word dripping with venom. "He was buying drinks for the house, playing the role of the heartbroken, devastated husband. He showed this to Sheriff Holden. He showed it to everyone." Wyatt ripped the paper from the post and shoved it into Clara's trembling hands. It was a marriage certificate. Beau Fletcher and Clara Vance. "He told the town that you are his legal wife," Wyatt sneered, the betrayal carving deep, agonizing lines into his face. "He said you seduced him, waited until he sold his property, and then robbed him blind in the middle of the night. He said you fled to the frontier, and that you've been using your tragic charms to manipulate a grieving widower into hiding you from the law." "Wyatt, it is a lie," Clara gasped, the paper shaking violently in her hands. "The certificate is a forgery. I swear to you on my life, it is a lie." "Is it?" Wyatt roared, the dam finally breaking. He stepped closer, towering over her, his chest heaving. "Because right now, I don't know who the hell I am looking at. You came here running from men in the East. You admitted you had a bounty on your head. And now a man shows up with legal papers saying you are a thieving runaway wife. The whole town thinks I am harboring a criminal. They think I am a fool who let a beautiful, manipulative woman into my home to take the place of my dead wife." The accusation felt like a physical blow to the stomach. Clara stumbled back a step, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "You think I manipulated you? You think the time we have spent together, you think how I care for Toby is a manipulation?" Wyatt's face contorted in agony. The betrayal warred fiercely with the desperate, deep affection he had begun to harbor for her. He looked at her tear-streaked face, his breathing ragged. "I don't know what to think, Clara. I've been lied to by the world since the day Eleanor burned. I thought you were different. I thought you understood the dark." He swallowed hard, looking away toward the jagged mountains. "Holden gave me 24 hours to turn you over to the federal marshal. If I don't, they ride out here and take you by force. And they arrest me for complicity." Beau had executed his threat flawlessly. He hadn't just cornered Clara. He had poisoned the entire town against Wyatt. If Wyatt fought back, he would be gunned down by his own neighbors, convinced they were enacting righteous frontier justice against a corrupted man. Wyatt turned his back on her, gripping the porch railing so hard the wood groaned. "Pack your things. I'll give you a horse and whatever money I have in the safe. If you ride hard into the mountains, you might lose them, but you can't stay here. I won't let my son watch a posse shoot this house to pieces." He didn't wait for her answer. He walked off the porch and headed straight for the barn, his shoulders bowed under the weight of a crushing, absolute defeat. Clara stood alone on the porch, the forged marriage certificate fluttering to the dirt at her feet. She had lost. Beau Fletcher had won. That night, the farmhouse was as silent as a graveyard. Clara packed her battered suitcase by the pale light of the moon streaming through her bedroom window. She folded the few practical dresses she owned, her movements robotic, entirely devoid of emotion. Her heart felt as though it had been carved out of her chest, leaving a gaping, freezing void. She walked softly down the hall to Toby's room. The door was slightly ajar. Clara slipped inside, gazing down at the sleeping boy. He was clutching a small wooden horse Wyatt had carved for him, his chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. A sob caught in Clara's throat. She knelt beside the bed, pressing a trembling kiss to his warm forehead. "I love you," she whispered into the dark. "I am so sorry I cannot stay to see you speak again." She left a folded note on the kitchen table. It didn't contain confessions of murder or bank conspiracies. It only contained the truth of her heart. "I did not lie to you, Wyatt. The only truth I know in this world is that you are a good man, and Toby is a beautiful boy. I am leaving to protect you from the darkness that follows me. Do not look for me." Clara picked up her heavy suitcase, wrapped her shawl tight against the bitter midnight chill, and slowly pulled open the heavy oak front door. She stepped out onto the porch, intending to slip into the shadows and disappear into the brutal Montana wilderness. But a sound stopped her cold, the distinct metallic clack of a rifle hammer being cocked back. Clara gasped, her eyes flying to the far, shadowed corner of the porch. Wyatt Thorne was sitting in a wooden rocking chair draped in the darkness. His Winchester repeating rifle rested across his thighs, his large hands gripping the dark wood of the stock. The moonlight caught the silver of his eyes, illuminating an expression of profound, immovable resolve. He didn't raise the gun. He just stared at her, taking in the suitcase in her hand and the tear stains on her pale face. Wyatt stood up slowly, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He stepped out of the shadows, the rifle held casually at his side. He looked down at her, the coldness of the afternoon entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, protective fire that stole the breath from Clara's lungs. "Are you going to run away into the dark?" Wyatt asked, his gravelly voice slicing through the silent night. "Just like he told them you would?" The metallic click of the rifle hammer echoed in the frigid night air, freezing the blood in Clara's veins. She stood on the edge of the porch, her knuckles white around the handle of her battered suitcase, the biting Montana wind whipping her shawl around her shoulders. Wyatt Thorne stepped out of the deep shadows, the moonlight carving the harsh, rugged lines of his face into granite. He lowered the Winchester repeating rifle, the barrel pointing safely at the wooden floorboards, but his stormy gray eyes remained locked on her. "Are you going to run away into the dark?" Wyatt repeated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the howling wind. "Just like he told them you would?" Clara's breath hitched in her throat, forming a white cloud in the freezing air. "I am leaving to protect you," she cried, her voice cracking with the sheer, agonizing weight of it all. "If I stay, they will destroy this ranch. They will destroy you, Wyatt. I will not let Toby lose his father because of me." Wyatt closed the distance between them in 3 long, deliberate strides. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked profoundly, unbearably weary. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand wrapping over hers where it gripped the suitcase handle. He didn't pull, but the gentle, immovable strength in his grip was an anchor holding her to the earth. "I spent the last 6 hours riding the fence line, freezing my blood, trying to figure out how a woman who sings my traumatized son to sleep could be the cold-blooded thief that paper claims she is," Wyatt said softly. His thumb brushed over her frozen knuckles. "It didn't make sense. None of it fit. And then I rode back and I saw you sneaking out the door with nothing but a broken suitcase, leaving everything behind just to keep the crosshairs off my back." He looked down at her, the moonlight catching the silver sheen of his eyes. "A thief takes what isn't hers and runs. You are trying to leave everything behind to save a man who yelled at you. You didn't lie to me, Clara. I know that now. I was a blind, angry fool this afternoon, and I am sorry." Clara stared at him, a ragged sob tearing its way up her throat. The heavy, suffocating wall she had built around herself began to crack, the pieces falling away into the dust. "Wyatt, come inside," he commanded gently, prying the suitcase from her stiff fingers. "The wind is turning to ice. We are going to sit by the fire. And you are going to tell me exactly who Beau Fletcher is, and why the devil he has decided to paint a target on your back." He led her back into the dimly lit farmhouse. The embers in the stone hearth were glowing a dull, angry red. Wyatt added 3 thick logs of split pine, prodding them with an iron until the flames leapt up, casting dancing, golden shadows across the room. He pointed to the heavy armchair. Clara sank into it, her entire body shaking, not from the cold, but from the terrifying precipice she was standing upon. If she told him the truth, she would shatter his world all over again. Wyatt set his rifle on the mantel, poured a measure of amber whiskey into a glass, and pressed it into her trembling hands. "Drink, then talk." Clara took a sip, the liquid burning a trail of liquid fire down her throat, steadying her nerves. She looked at the man standing before her. Wyatt was strong, but the guilt of his wife's death was a cancer eating away at his soul. She had to cut it out, even if the blade hurt them both. "I cannot just tell you," Clara whispered, setting the glass on the side table. "I have to show you. Wait here." She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, and walked down the hall to her small bedroom. She knelt by the bed, prying up the loose floorboard she had discovered her first week here. She bypassed the hunting knife and pulled out the small stack of letters tied with the faded, dusty ribbon. When she returned to the great room, Wyatt was watching her with a cautious, heavy gaze. Clara walked right up to him and pressed the letters against his broad chest. "I found these hidden behind a loose panel in your study," Clara said, her voice shaking. "I found them days ago. I am so sorry I kept them from you, Wyatt, but I was terrified of what the truth would do to you." Wyatt took the letters. He frowned, turning the bundle over in his large hands. He slipped the ribbon off and opened the top envelope, pulling out the folded parchment. His eyes scanned the elegant, sweeping handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, Wyatt does not deserve you. Bring the deed as we discussed. We will sell the land and leave this wretched dust behind." Clara watched as the blood completely drained from Wyatt's face. His jaw went slack, then clamped shut so hard a muscle twitched violently in his cheek. He read the first letter, then the second, then the third. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the pine logs and the ragged, increasingly shallow sound of Wyatt's breathing. "Beau Fletcher did not come to Blackwood just to swindle me," Clara said softly, her words falling like stones into a still pond. "He works for the Pacific Union Bank. They want this land for the railway's water reservoir. He came here 2 years ago to seduce Eleanor and convince her to steal the original deed to the ranch, so they could sell it out from under you." Wyatt didn't move. He stared at the letters, his eyes wide and unseeing. She was going to leave me. She was going to take the boy and the land." "No." Clara stepped closer, her heart breaking at the devastation in his voice. "She didn't do it, Wyatt. Beau told me everything today in the alleyway beside the mercantile. Eleanor grew a conscience at the last second. The night she died, she went to the barn to meet him, but she refused to give him the deed. She threatened to expose him." Wyatt slowly looked up from the papers. The papers in his hands were trembling so violently they made a dry, rustling sound. "What are you saying?" Clara reached out, placing her hands flat against his chest, right over his hammering heart. "It was not an accident, Wyatt. You did not leave a lantern burning. You were not careless. Beau Fletcher struck your wife. When she fell unconscious, he barred the heavy stable doors from the outside, and he set the fire. The air in the room vanished. Wyatt's eyes dilated, eclipsing the gray entirely. A sound tore its way out of his throat, a horrifying guttural noise that was half sob, half roar. It was the sound of a man having his soul ripped open and stitched back together without anesthesia. The letters slipped from his fingers, fluttering to the floorboards like dead leaves. "He burned her," Wyatt choked out, stumbling backward until his spine hit the heavy timber of the wall. He gripped his own hair, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "He locked her in, and he burned her." "It was murder, Wyatt," Clara cried, tears streaming down her face as she closed the distance between them, refusing to let him fall apart alone. "The guilt you have carried every single day for the past year, it does not belong to you. It belongs to him. You did everything you could to save her. You saved Toby." Wyatt slid down the wall, collapsing to his knees on the rug. The mighty, untouchable rancher buried his face in his massive hands, his broad shoulders shaking with violent, racking sobs. All the agonizing grief, the self-hatred, the nightmares of smoke and ash. It all crashed down upon him in a tidal wave of horrific realization. He hadn't failed his family. He had been robbed of them. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She simply threw her arms around his thick neck, pulling his head against her shoulder, burying her face in his dark hair. She held him as fiercely as she could, absorbing the shockwaves of his shattered reality. They stayed like that for a long time on the floor of the dimly lit cabin, the fire popping and hissing in the grate. Slowly, the violent tremors racking Wyatt's frame began to subside. The paralyzing grief was burning away, leaving behind something much darker, much harder, and infinitely more dangerous. Pure, unadulterated vengeance. Wyatt lifted his head. His face was wet with tears, but his stormy gray eyes had turned into chips of absolute freezing ice. He looked at Clara, his gaze dropping to her lips, then back up to her eyes. "He gave me an ultimatum," Clara whispered, the space between them suddenly crackling with an intense electric heat. 3 days. If I do not find the deed and give it to him, he will send the New York men to kill you, and he will make sure the law hangs you." Wyatt's hands moved from his lap, his large, calloused fingers gently framing Clara's tear-stained face. His thumbs wiped away the moisture on her cheeks. "He is a dead man," Wyatt growled, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise. "He came to my home. He burned my wife. He broke my son. And now he has threatened the woman who brought the light back into this house." Clara's breath caught. The woman who brought the light back. Before she could process the weight of his words, Wyatt leaned in. He didn't ask for permission, and she didn't want him to. His mouth crashed down over hers in a desperate, bruising, all-consuming kiss. It wasn't a gentle, romantic embrace. It was a collision of two desperate survivors, a primal claiming born of grief, terror, and a sudden, undeniable salvation. Clara gasped against his lips, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, anchoring him to the present. Wyatt groaned, his massive arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her slightly off her knees, pressing her flush against his chest. He tasted like whiskey, salt, and overwhelming heat. When he finally pulled back, they were both gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other. Wyatt's eyes burned with a fierce, possessive fire. "You are not running anymore, Clara," Wyatt swore, his breath hot against her lips. "We are going to find that deed, and then we are going to use it to dig Beau Fletcher a grave he will never climb out of." The dawn broke over the jagged peaks of the Montana mountains like a spilled drop of blood, painting the bruised sky in streaks of violent crimson and bruised purple. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Wyatt stood across from her, a map of the surrounding territory spread out over the scarred wood. He had spent the remaining hours of the night cleaning every weapon in his arsenal. His Winchester rifle lay fully loaded on the table. His Colt revolver was strapped securely to his thigh, the leather holster oiled and silent. "If I ride into town and shoot him in the street, the law will hang me before the sun sets," Wyatt said, his voice a low, methodical rasp. The wild rage of the night before had cooled into a terrifying, calculated precision. "Holden has the forged marriage certificate. To the town, Beau is a wronged husband. I'd be swinging from a rope, and Toby would be sent to an orphanage. And if we give him the deed to buy our safety, the bank wins," Clara added, her mind racing. "Beau will take the land. The New York men will still hunt me, and he will never pay for what he did to Eleanor." "So we don't shoot him in town, and we don't give him the land," Wyatt said, his eyes tracing the contour lines on the map. His finger stopped on a narrow, shadowed gorge 5 miles north of the ranch. "We draw him out. We make him come to us." Clara leaned forward, studying the map. "Dead Man's Ridge." "It's a blind canyon," Wyatt explained, his jaw tight. "Only one way in, one way out. Steep rock walls on 3 sides. It's where we push the herd during the winter blizzards to block the wind. It's isolated, quiet, and out of the sheriff's jurisdiction." "We use the deed as bait," Clara concluded, her heart thumping a steady war drum rhythm. "Exactly," Wyatt nodded. "Did you find it?" Clara shook her head, frustration biting at her. "I have searched every inch of this house, Wyatt. Under the floorboards, inside the mattress, behind the bricks in the hearth. If Eleanor hid it here, she took the secret to her grave." Wyatt stared at the wall for a long moment, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Then he walked over to his heavy oak desk in the corner of the room. He unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a thick, official-looking document bound with a red ribbon. He tossed it onto the kitchen table. Clara frowned, picking it up. "What is this?" "It's the deed to my grandfather's old mining claim in the Dakotas. It's completely worthless dust and rock," Wyatt said grimly. "But from 10 feet away, in the dying light of dusk, it looks exactly like the land grant for this ranch." Clara looked at the document, a daring, reckless plan crystallizing in her mind. "I will ride to the edge of town this morning. I will hire a boy to deliver a message to Beau at the saloon. I will tell him I found the deed, but I refuse to meet him in town where Wyatt might see us. I will demand we make the exchange at Dead Man's Ridge an hour before sundown." "He will come armed," Wyatt warned, his eyes locking onto hers. "He won't plan on letting you walk away with the $1,000, Clara. He intends to take the deed and bury you in the canyon." "I know," Clara said softly, a steely, unyielding resolve hardening her features. "But he won't be meeting just me." Wyatt's hand reached across the map, his rough fingers closing over hers. "I will be in the rocks above the trail. The second he shows his hand, the second he admits to what he did, I will drop him in the dirt. But Clara, you will be the bait. If my aim is off, if he draws faster than I can pull the trigger." "Your aim will not be off," Clara said with absolute, unwavering faith. "We fight together." By mid-afternoon, the trap was set. Clara had ridden the perimeter trail near Blackwood, paying a passing farmhand a silver dollar to deliver a sealed envelope to the saloon. Now, as the sun began its slow, agonizing descent toward the western peaks, Clara sat atop a gentle roan mare in the center of Dead Man's Ridge. The canyon was a cathedral of towering red rock, the air still and suffocatingly silent. The shadows stretched long and skeletal across the dusty floor. Clara held the rolled-up mining deed in her gloved hand, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would spook the horse. High above her, hidden perfectly among the jagged boulders and scrub brush, Wyatt lay flat on his stomach. He had an unobstructed view of the canyon entrance, the stock of the Winchester pressed tight against his shoulder, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The wind whistled through the gorge, carrying the scent of dry sage. Then the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. Clara stiffened, her spine going rigid. She tightened her grip on the reins. 3 riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon. They rode at a slow, deliberate walk, their horses kicking up small clouds of red dust. The setting sun was directly behind them, casting them in dark, featureless silhouettes. Clara squinted against the glare, her stomach knotting. Something was wrong. As the riders drew closer, the shadows receded from their faces. None of them wore a pristine charcoal coat. None of them possessed the slick, aristocratic bearing of Beau Fletcher. These men were rough, clad in dusty canvas coats and bowler hats. They had the hard, flat eyes of street killers. The man in the center, a heavily scarred thug with a thick mustache, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt as he pulled his horse to a halt 30 yards from Clara. "You're a long way from New York, Miss Vance," the man called out, his thick, guttural accent echoing off the rocks. The blood drained from Clara's face. A wave of pure, paralyzing terror crashed over her. It wasn't Beau. It was Vitiello's men. "Where is Fletcher?" Clara shouted, trying to keep her horse from dancing backward. The thug laughed, a dry, grating sound. "Fletcher? The fancy-pants banker? He tipped us off yesterday. Said you'd be waiting right here with a forged deed, trying to skip town. He told us we could collect our bounty and take whatever cash you had on you." The man drew a heavy revolver from his coat. "It's time to pay your daddy's debts, sweetheart." No. The realization hit Clara with the force of a runaway train. Beau had never intended to meet her. He had read her note, realized she was trying to lure him away from the ranch, and used her own trap against her. He had sent the debt collectors to execute her, keeping his own hands perfectly clean, which meant Beau knew Wyatt would be here guarding her, which meant the ranch was undefended. "Wyatt!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing through the canyon. "He's at the ranch! Toby is alone!" Before the thugs could raise their weapons, a shot rang out from the cliffs above. Crack! The rifle fire was deafening. The lead thug's horse reared wildly as a bullet kicked up a shower of rock and dust inches from the horse's front hooves. The men shouted, scrambling to draw their weapons, aiming blindly at the rocks above. "Drop the guns!" Wyatt's voice roared from the cliffs, booming with the wrath of an Old Testament god. He levered the rifle with blinding speed. Crack! Another bullet shattered the pommel of the second thug's saddle, sending the man tumbling backward into the dirt with a cry of shock. "I have the high ground and a repeating rifle," Wyatt bellowed. "The next shot goes through a skull. Drop the iron and ride or die in the dirt." The remaining men, realizing they were sitting ducks in a kill box, didn't hesitate. They spurred their horses, abandoning their fallen comrade, and galloped back toward the mouth of the canyon, cursing loudly into the wind. Wyatt didn't wait to see if they would return. He scrambled down the treacherous rock face, his boots sliding on the loose shale, hitting the canyon floor at a dead run. He vaulted onto the back of his black stallion, his face a mask of absolute paralyzing terror. "Ride!" Wyatt yelled, spurring the massive horse into a furious breakneck gallop. Clara drove her heels into the roan's sides, leaning low over the horse's neck as she tore after him. The wind roared in her ears, whipping her hair into her eyes. "Please, God, please, no." Clara prayed, tears blurring her vision as the landscape flew by in a dizzying blur. Beau Fletcher wasn't just a banker. He was a man who burned loose ends. He had realized the deed wasn't going to be handed over quietly. So he had gone back to his original plan. He had gone to the ranch to burn it to the ground, just as he had done to the barn, hoping the deed would either burn with it or be found in the ashes. And Toby, small, silent, innocent Toby, was locked inside. They crested the final ridge just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the valley into twilight. Wyatt pulled back on the rein so hard the stallion screamed. Clara pulled up beside him, her heart stopping completely. Down in the valley, billowing into the darkening sky, was a thick black pillar of smoke. The farmhouse was on fire. The descent into the valley was a blur of tearing wind and blind, desperate panic. Wyatt's black stallion tore down the narrow mountain trail, its hooves kicking up showers of loose shale, nearly slipping on the treacherous incline. Clara rode hard on his heels, her heart hammering a frantic, agonizing rhythm against her ribs. The sky above the Thorn Ranch was choked with thick, oily, black smoke. The setting sun caught the underside of the clouds, painting them the color of a fresh bruise. As they burst through the tree line and into the clearing, the sheer, horrific scale of Beau Fletcher's cruelty was laid bare. The front porch of the farmhouse was entirely engulfed in roaring, ravenous flames. The fire was climbing the dry timber of the walls, licking at the second-story windows. The heat radiated across the yard, a solid, suffocating wall that hit Clara the moment she hauled back on her mare's reins. Standing in the center of the yard, illuminated by the hellish orange glow, was Beau Fletcher. He had discarded his pristine charcoal coat. In one hand, he held an empty tin of kerosene, in the other, a silver-plated revolver. He had wedged a massive iron-reinforced wagon axle across the outside of the heavy oak front door, sealing it shut. "Wyatt!" Clara screamed, slipping from her saddle before the horse had even stopped. Wyatt hit the ground running, the Winchester rifle gripped in his massive hands. But the moment his boots slammed into the red dirt of the yard, the wind shifted. A thick cloud of acrid black smoke rolled over him, carrying the overwhelming chemical stench of burning wood and kerosene. Wyatt stopped dead. His Winchester slipped from his fingers, hitting the dust with a dull thud. His broad shoulders violently seized, the stormy gray of his eyes shattered, replaced by the empty black voids of absolute terror. He wasn't in the yard anymore. He was a year in the past. He was standing outside the barn, listening to the agonizing screams of his wife. "No," Wyatt choked out, his hands flying to his head. He stumbled backward, his knees buckling. "Eleanor, I can't. The beam is too heavy. I can't move it." "Wyatt!" Clara cried, rushing toward him, grabbing his arm. "Wyatt, look at me. It's the house. Toby is in the house." But Wyatt was gone, entirely swallowed by the suffocating grip of his PTSD. He collapsed to his knees in the dirt, gasping for air that wasn't there, paralyzed by a ghost he couldn't fight. "Well, isn't this a tragic repetition of history?" Beau's smooth, mocking voice cut through the roar of the flames. He casually tossed the empty kerosene tin aside and leveled his silver revolver at Clara's chest. "I must admit, Clara, I am surprised to see you. I assumed Vitiello's men would have put a bullet in you by now. But no matter. You can die here just the same." Clara stepped in front of Wyatt, shielding his broken form with her own body. She stared down the barrel of Beau's gun, the heat of the burning farmhouse searing the back of her neck. "Let the boy out, Beau. He has nothing to do with this." "The boy is a loose end," Beau said coldly, cocking the hammer of the revolver. "He saw me lock the door, just like his mother saw me. I cannot have witnesses, Clara. Once this house burns, I will tell the sheriff that Wyatt went mad with grief, burned his own son, and shot you before turning the gun on himself. It will be a frontier tragedy, and the bank will take the land." Inside the burning house, a window on the second floor suddenly shattered. Clara's head snapped up. Through the broken glass and billowing smoke, a small, soot-stained face appeared. Toby. He was coughing violently, his small hands gripping the window frame, staring down at the nightmare unfolding in the yard. Beau smiled, a thin, reptilian stretching of his lips. He adjusted his aim, pointing the revolver directly at Clara's heart. "Goodbye, my sweet bride." Up in the window, Toby saw the gun aimed at the woman who had sung him to sleep. The boy, who had been locked in a prison of absolute silence for 365 days, opened his mouth, his lungs filling with smoke and desperate, terrifying love. "Mama!" Toby screamed, his voice raw, jagged, and piercing enough to shatter the sky. "Mama, he has a gun!" The word hit the yard like a lightning bolt. "Mama!" Wyatt's head snapped up. The phantom screams of his dead wife vanished, obliterated by the very real, very desperate voice of his living son. The suffocating haze of smoke in his mind cleared instantly, replaced by a surge of pure, lethal adrenaline. He was not in the past. He was here. and the devil was aiming a gun at the woman he loved. Before Bo could pull the trigger, Wyatt lunged. He didn't move like a man. He moved like a force of nature. He crossed the 10 yards of dirt in a fraction of a second, his massive shoulders slamming into Bo's chest with the force of a runaway freight train. The silver revolver fired wildly into the night sky as Bo was thrown backward, crashing brutally into the dirt. Wyatt didn't give him a second to breathe. He straddled Bo, his scarred, calloused fists raining down with terrifying mechanized brutality. The first punch shattered Bo's nose, spraying blood across the pristine white collar of his shirt. The second cracked his jaw. Wyatt wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting the monster who had murdered his wife, the ghost that had haunted his nightmares, and the threat that had almost taken Clara. "Wyatt, stop!" Clara screamed, grabbing his shoulder as Bo went limp in the dirt, completely unconscious and broken. "Toby! We have to get Toby!" Wyatt snapped out of his bloodlust. He threw Bo aside like a rag doll and sprinted toward the burning porch. Ignoring the blistering heat that singed his eyebrows and blistered his skin, Wyatt grabbed the massive iron wagon axle wedged against the door. He roared, his muscles bulging, pulling with the strength born of pure desperation until the iron gave way, clattering to the porch. He kicked the heavy oak door open. A wall of black smoke poured out. Wyatt dove into the inferno, vanishing into the burning house. Clara stood in the yard, her hands pressed over her mouth, coughing from the smoke, her heart entirely stopped in her chest. The seconds stretched into agonizing eternities. The roof groaned, the timber beginning to pop and fracture under the intense heat. "Please," Clara prayed, falling to her knees in the dirt. "Please, do not take them from me." A massive figure burst through the smoke. Wyatt stumbled out onto the porch and down the steps, his coat smoldering, his face blackened with soot. Clutched tightly to his broad chest, wrapped safely in a thick wool quilt, was Toby. Wyatt collapsed onto the grass a safe distance from the house, gasping for clean air. Clara scrambled toward them, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around Wyatt's neck, burying her face in his shoulder, before frantically pulling the quilt back to check the boy. Toby was coughing, his face streaked with soot and tears, but he was alive. He looked up at Clara with his stormy gray eyes, reaching out his small, trembling arms. "Mama," Toby sobbed, burying his face in her neck, his small hands fisting tightly in the fabric of her dress. Clara held him, rocking him back and forth, her own tears mixing with the soot on his cheeks. "I've got you, sweetheart. I've got you. You're safe." Wyatt wrapped his massive arms around both of them, pulling them into his chest, creating an impenetrable fortress of muscle and bone. He pressed a kiss into Clara's soot-stained hair, his chest heaving with exhaustion and overwhelming relief. The farmhouse behind them collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending a shower of golden sparks into the night sky. But Wyatt didn't look back. The past was finally burning away. The only thing that mattered was right here, held tightly in his arms. Spring arrived in Montana not with a whisper, but with a triumphant shout. The snow melt from the jagged peaks rushed into the valley, turning the harsh red dirt into a vibrant, sprawling canvas of emerald green. The air smelled of sweet pine, wet earth, and the sharp, clean promise of a new beginning. Clara stood on the wraparound porch of the newly rebuilt farmhouse, wiping her hands on her apron. The house was smaller than the original, built with fresh-cut timber that still smelled of sap, but it was solid, warm, and utterly theirs. She looked out across the corral. Wyatt was leaning against the wooden fence, his Stetson pushed back on his head, laughing, a deep, resonant sound that still made Clara's heart skip a beat. He was watching Toby, who was currently sitting atop a gentle speckled pony, chattering away with a breathless, endless enthusiasm. "And then the dog chased the chicken, Papa, right into the barn." Toby giggled, his gray eyes bright and entirely free of the shadows that had once haunted them. "Is that right?" Wyatt smiled, reaching through the fence to ruffle the boy's dark hair. "I suppose you'll have to be the one to catch the chicken before supper, then." Clara smiled, leaning against the porch railing. The transformation in the Thorn men over the last 6 months had been nothing short of miraculous. The night of the fire had changed everything. Sheriff Holden, drawn by the smoke and the distant gunfire, had arrived with a posse just as the roof caved in. They found Bo Fletcher beaten half to death and bound with heavy rope in the dirt. When Bo was hauled into the jail cell, his arrogance finally broke. Faced with the hangman's noose for arson and attempted murder, he confessed to the Pacific Union Bank's conspiracy, hoping to trade the bankers for a lighter sentence. It hadn't worked. The territorial judge was a man of the frontier, and he had no patience for men who burned women in barns. Bo Fletcher was sentenced to hang, and the corrupt bankers in the East were indicted. More importantly, the Pacific Union Bank, desperate to avoid a massive public scandal regarding their land-grabbing tactics, had offered Wyatt a substantial, quiet settlement to drop any civil suits. Wyatt had taken the money and handed half of it directly to Clara. She had immediately wired the funds to the Vitiello family in New York, paying off her father's gambling debts with interest. The bounty on her head was lifted. For the first time in her life, Clara Vance was a free woman, unbound by fear, debt, or the violent ghosts of her past. Wyatt patted the pony's neck, murmured something to Toby, and then turned, his long, deliberate strides carrying him across the yard toward the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps, looking up at Clara. The harsh, bitter lines that had once defined his face were gone, replaced by a quiet, profound peace. "The boy talks more than a saloon keep on a Friday night," Wyatt remarked, a fond, amused glint in his eyes. "He has a year of silence to make up for," Clara replied softly, descending the steps until she was standing on the bottom stair, exactly at eye level with him. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the jagged scar along his jawline. "You look tired. You've been up since before dawn fixing the southern fence." "I have energy enough," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate gravel that was reserved entirely for her. His hands moved to her waist, spanning the curve of her hips, drawing her slightly closer. He didn't pull her into a kiss. Instead, Wyatt Thorne, the massive, scarred, untouchable rancher of Blackwood, took a step back and slowly dropped to one knee in the red Montana dirt. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. Wyatt reached into the pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a small, simple band. It wasn't gold or adorned with diamonds. He had spent the last 3 nights in the blacksmith shed, melting down the silver plating from Bo Fletcher's confiscated revolver, forging the metal of their nightmare into a solid, unbroken circle. He looked up at her, his stormy gray eyes completely bare, holding nothing but absolute, overwhelming love. "You came to this town looking for a man who didn't exist," Wyatt said, his voice steady, anchoring her to the earth. "You found a broken house, a silent boy, and a man who was drowning in his own dark. You didn't run, Clara. When the fire came, when the monsters came, you stood your ground. You brought my son back to life. You brought me back to life." Tears spilled over Clara's lashes, tracking hot and fast down her cheeks. But she was smiling so hard her face ached. "I am not a man of poetry or grand promises," Wyatt continued, holding the silver ring up between them. "I can only promise you the truth. I will protect you with my last breath. I will love you until the mountains crumble into the dust, and I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid again." He took a deep breath, his massive chest expanding. "Clara Vance, will you do me the absolute honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Clara choked out, slipping off the bottom step and dropping to her knees in the dirt right in front of him. "Yes, Wyatt. 1,000 times, yes." Wyatt exhaled a shuddering breath of relief. He took her left hand, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he slid the forged silver band onto her ring finger. It was a perfect fit. Before she could admire it, Wyatt's large hands framed her face, and he pulled her into a deep, desperate, consuming kiss. It was a promise sealed in fire and forged in survival. Clara wrapped her arms around his thick neck, kissing him back with every ounce of love she possessed, entirely oblivious to the dirt staining the hem of her dress. "Papa!" Mama! They pulled apart, both of them breathing heavily, resting their foreheads together as they looked toward the corral. Toby had slipped off the pony and was running toward them, his boots thudding against the earth, a massive, gap-toothed grin spreading across his face. Wyatt stood up, effortlessly pulling Clara to her feet alongside him. As Toby launched himself at them, Wyatt caught the boy mid-air, lifting him high before settling him securely into the crook of his arm. He wrapped his free arm around Clara's waist, pulling her tightly against his side. Clara leaned her head against Wyatt's broad shoulder, her hand resting on Toby's back, the silver ring gleaming in the afternoon sun. She looked out at the sprawling, beautiful, unforgiving landscape of the frontier. She had waited at the station for a lie. But out here, in the dust and the ashes, a little boy had reached out his hand, and she had found the most beautiful, hard-won truth in the world. She was finally, truly, home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.